We're live. All right.
Good evening and welcome to Our Front Porch. This is the last Taking Questions program of 2020, but don't worry, we'll be back in 21, right, Larry?
Yep.
All right, so tonight we have Larry back again, thank goodness, and we welcome Tim Roberts. I wanted just to say thanks to Larry. I think this has been a lifeline for us this year. It really has been great working with you and the Department of History and Political Science.
Thank you.
Everybody that's involved, thank you. It's kind of given us a way to get our feet under us online and try this out. And thanks to all of you who have participated with questions and donations and patience with our technical difficulties. So I think tonight we've upped our game with our new mics.
Yes.
So those of you that donated, we put the money right back in and we bought another mic. So hopefully it'll sound really great. So thank you for that. And also we want to thank the Illinois Humanities Council for their COVID relief grant. That again also helps us kind of try new ways to bring the humanities to our community. So thanks to them. Our front porch is where we have informal conversations and we pass down our history and our culture together, and everybody's welcome. So you can use the comment section below to ask us a question or maybe introduce yourself or say hello. We'd love to hear from you. So the way this works is everybody's welcome. We have a friendly, respectful conversation, and Larry and Tim have agreed to be here till 8:30 taking your questions. And you're kind of the head honcho here, right? You got your hat tonight.
Yes.
So you're kind of the marshal. Can we
Yeah.
call you Marshal?
You
All right,
can if you want.
You'll keep order, right? That sounds good. So we will be back again in 2021 with a handful of other people, and please, suggestions and comments are welcome for other ways we can continue to bring history and culture to you all. So you ready?
Yep.
Are you ready?
I'm ready.
All right, let's do this. So you guys, let's see if we got any questions, but if
Okay.
not, we'll...
I'll start. Let me introduce my colleague tonight. I want to welcome Tim Roberts, who's literally my replacement in the history department. He is the Civil War person. I was the Civil War person. And if you want to know what I looked like 25 years ago, that's what I look like, okay? Tim is the author of two really good books on the Civil War era, one particularly in local, regional history. He teaches the middle period, which is Jefferson, Jackson, as well as the Civil War. You still teach history of American law?
Yes.
Okay. So he's a multifaceted individual, and he's consented to be with us tonight. That we're going to talk, answer questions, hold a conversation about our common interest. We are dealing tonight, really, two historians considering the Civil War era, which we're defining as from about 1848 to 1876. So let me start, Tim, by asking you a nice soft question. You are not only an expert on the Civil War, but on Illinois in the Civil War. You've got a book on the standards, a couple from Canton, Illinois. Mm-hmm. What was going on in the state of Illinois and in this region during the Civil War?
Well, thanks, Larry. And again, thanks, Sue and the museum for hosting this nice event. I'm really honored to be here tonight. The Illinois is nowadays, I think, considered, of course, a solid Union state, a state that supplied the fourth most number of soldiers of any Union state during the war. 170 regiments, lots and lots of soldiers Illinois supplied for the Union Army. Illinois was a very prominent, powerful state in 1860. We forget that two, Larry, of the four men who ran for president in 1860 were Illinoisans.
Right.
Right. So half of the battle for the presidency in 1860 were Illinoisans. Of course, those being Stephen Douglas and Abraham Lincoln. Not everybody, though, in the state supported the war. I think it's important for us to just take a perspective of the Illinois population at the time of the Civil War. It was only after the Civil War that most of the representatives in the Illinois legislature were from the northern part of the state. Really until after the Civil War, downstate Illinois had a heavier population in the northern part of the state. And this really had political consequences. A lot of Illinoisans had come to Illinois from the upper South, Kentucky, Tennessee, Virginia, the Carolinas. Some of those people came to Macomb. And they brought their cultural and political values with them. The couple that I wrote about, William and Jane Standard, were from Lewiston and Fulton County. They were typical of these upland Southerners who came and settled. They got land, they got what they wanted. They really, a lot of the people who came here couldn't hack it in the eastern part of the country, and they came out here and really settled on the frontier. These people are very socially, politically conservative. The man I wrote about in my book, This Infernal War, William Standard, a landowner, a former sheriff of Fulton County, a school teacher, so he erudite. His handwriting was very easy to read. Very smart guy, but very conservative. He joins up in the Illinois 103rd Regiment. Of course, most Illinois soldiers supported the Union. They were probably Republicans. He was not. He was a hardcore Democrat. He opposed Abraham Lincoln. A virulent, I would say, hardcore, kind of expresses very harsh racial attitudes towards Black people. And so there was this internal tension in Illinois society, Illinois politics, among Illinois soldiers, among people who were like him, who just wanted to get the war over, didn't really mind one way or the other about slavery, believed that Lincoln was the nemesis of the working class white man. At one time, Standard writes to his wife, Lincoln wants to kill all the white men to save the Black man. And he just could not figure out why Lincoln was so inspired to do this. So there's a lot of tension in Illinois,
Did he
in
ever
short.
soften on that?
He did not. There are other accounts, and there's a book that I use, one of the books I suggest anybody read if they're interested. It's a book by Chandra Manning, What This Cruel War Was Over. Talks about the kind of typical transformation of Northern men who were not for the ending of slavery. By the time of the war ends, they become kind of more or less abolitionists. Standard did not. He was pretty consistent in his views, and I think he represents the kind of view of a lot of people who came back to this part of the country after the war. Illinois remained, certainly in the downstate area, very democratic, and not a terribly friendly place to people of color throughout the 19th and even early into the 20th century.
As I recall, Illinois was settled from the south up.
Yeah.
And the first capital of Illinois was south.
Mm-hmm.
And it wasn't until about 1840 they moved the capital to Springfield, the
Right.
center part of the state. Lincoln, I think, had 3 law partners. I think each one of them was a Kentucky.
That's right.
As was
Lincoln.
And as was Lincoln's wife,
Right.
Mary Todd. So there's a very strong Kentucky influence. And as I recall, when Lincoln served that one term in Congress in the 1840s, he was maybe the only Whig congressman Illinois had. Maybe there was one other, but most of the time, most of the offices in Illinois were held by Democrats.
Right.
Even after, middle 1850s, Richard Yates becomes governor, and he's a Republican. But he governed pretty carefully because of that.
And the Illinois legislature during the war was Democratic. And they were really, the governor and the legislature really feuded.
And didn't Yates send the legislature home prorogued? I think
right.
was the word.
Yeah.
And he governed with private funds and loans from the War Department.
Right.
And something similar happened in Indiana with Governor Morton. So 2 of the major states in the Midwest in the middle 1860s were supported by money from Washington, not by locally supported. And there was a legislature in each case not funding. They were home.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If you were going to start reading about Illinois in the Civil War, would you start with Vic Hicken's book?
Yeah. We were just talking about it before we started, but great book, WIU professor, Illinois in the Civil War.
From about 1966 or 67.
Yeah,
it's republished.
It's an old nugget, but very worthwhile a read on the land of Lincoln during the war. And it shows you some of the complexity of the state, both on the home front and in the ranks.
In many ways, it's the model state study during the state during the Civil War.
Mhm.
And let's divert a little bit. In the senatorial election of 1858, Lincoln versus Douglas, one of the hard things I always had to do accomplish in class was convince the people in class that at that time, Douglas was much the better well-known of the two, had much more national prominence. And many people thought he would be the president in 1860.
Mhm.
Would you agree with that? Does that seem reasonable?
Yeah, I think Lincoln begins to emerge or reemerge in his debates with Douglas. There's no question that Douglas is consenting to debate Lincoln 7 times, really successfully put Lincoln in the national spotlight. You can't imagine Lincoln, I think, even running for president maybe in 1860 without having debated Douglas in 58. So, yeah, I think in 58, people may have thought it was Douglas's election to lose in 1860. I think that something that we really, I think there's a lot of evidence happened right here. When Lincoln comes to visit, stays in Macomb, he develops this question he'll ask Douglas in the Freeport debate about whether Douglas would support allowing local governments in the West to abolish, to ban slavery, and he says yes. As a lot of historians believe, this alienates the South. They remember what Douglas said, and it comes back to bite Douglas in 1860, and it fractures the Democratic Party, and certainly goes a long way to helping Lincoln become president.
Douglas's presidential possibilities are nil unless he wins this reelection. And it doesn't, I mean, Lincoln would much have preferred to win, but it gave him that prominence. He stood toe to toe with the most prominent non-presidential Democrat in the country.
Yeah.
By all odds, maybe the most controversial politician of the whole decade of the 1850s is Stephen Douglas. I mean, could you not argue that maybe one of the key events that caused the Civil War was the Kansas-Nebraska Act that Douglas boasted he was the sole author of? What would you think about that?
Yeah, so this is really hardcore political history.
Yep.
The Kansas-Nebraska Act
I'll let you explain.
Authorizes Western U.S. territories, not subject to state law at the time yet, to decide for themselves whether they will have slavery, the great issue of the day. So what? Well, the so what is that law seemed to rescind a law that had been on the books for the previous 34 years, the Missouri Compromise, which had banned slavery south of the southern Missouri border. And this was, I try to convey to students what it was. I mean, it was a kind of a bombshell in the North. I mean, it's like, and then of course, basically the Missouri Compromise does get officially overturned in 1857, which maybe is a little bit more of a
complicates things
of a destabilizing event. But it's almost like if you take a law that we think is fundamental, okay, I'm just going to throw it out there, Roe v. Wade, which landmark case about abortion. If the Supreme Court were to overturn that and to reverse it, what would be the aftershock in American society and politics? I mean, this is a little bit like what happens in the 1850s. It totally backfires on Douglas. He did not anticipate that this would be such an explosive issue.
He said, as I recall, coming home on the train from Washington after that passage, he could have found his way by his burning effigies along the roadside.
Yeah.
And remember, too, this comes right in the midst of a major political transformation in the country. I mean, by 1854, the Whig Party is just about dead, and there's a new coalescence of issues which the Kansas-Nebraska Act helps. That's the Republican Party, which is pledged against the further spread of slavery.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there are other people in there too. There are bigots from the Know Nothing movement, and there are people who are prohibitionists and so forth. But right down in the nubbing of it, that you have major change in the political system superimposed almost immediately on top of the Kansas-Nebraska Act.
Right.
I mean, you can make a case, could you not, that the 1850s were the most, maybe in the standpoint of stability, the most difficult decade in the country's history.
Well, from what I've heard, the 1960s are pretty unstable. And, I think to give students a flavor, the 1850s are kind of like that. People do not believe that institutions function to deliver law and order, and there's a lot of mistrust. Now, I don't want to push the point too much, but in 2020, there is a lot of, shall we say, doubt among some Americans about whether political and legal institutions are functioning the way that they are supposed to, and they deliver the results. And I think we get a little bit of a taste for how, as it turns out, whole regions of the country decide to, quit on the law and take matters into their own hands in the 1850s. I would, Larry, we asked me before this program what I think was the great event that makes the war more likely, and I really think it's John Brown, a Northerner who comes into the South. Weird John Brown.
Salts.
Melville calls him, I think, we don't really know what he was trying to be believed he was going to accomplish, but he causes Southerners in his raid on Harper's Ferry at the time, an armory in Virginia, the leading Southern state. He causes Southerners to panic, and a lot of Southerners, sincerely or duplicitously, believe that the Republican Party
was behind this.
Is behind it. What's telling, and I've never been to a document, but I've heard that after John Brown, all the Southern students who were in college in the North dropped out of classes,
came home.
And that was really the beginning of this kind of pretty strong sectionalism, in the sense that you're not safe anymore outside your region, and it's time to really make sure you have your powder dry and your pistol ready.
This is the same John Brown 4 years earlier, 3.5 years earlier, who he and his sons murdered 5 pro-Southern settlers in Kansas at Osawatomie Creek. It's clear he never denied doing it. There was a warrant out for him, and he traveled more or less openly in anti-slavery circles for the next 2 or 3 years. What's it? 6 degrees of separation. Then John Brown assaulted Harper's Ferry. He managed to get himself trapped in the engine house by irritated and outraged town people and militia. And it was pretty close to Washington, D.C., and a contingent of U.S. troops shows up, commanded by Robert E. Lee, assisted by Jeb Stuart, who becomes a Confederate cavalry general. And they subdued John Brown, who then manfully stands trial, almost like a martyr. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave, the famous song from the era. And it's hard to see the man anything but a villain, but in some ways he's kind of a noble villain. I mean, he didn't try to flee. He didn't deny what he had done, demented though it may have been.
Southerners saw him as a terrorist. Some Northerners, Lincoln was horrified,
Yes.
Seward was horrified, but other Northerners saluted him as a martyr. There is an element of terrorism to what Brown does. He has this kind of religious view of himself. He has a political agenda. He wants to create violence for a political cause. And again, some Northerners really saluted him as a kind of a holy warrior. Striking at the heart of evil.
And it was disclosed he was supported by a group of 6 prominent New Englanders, the Secret Six, who funneled money to him and gave him advice and shelter and so forth.
Right.
It's a very interesting thing. And you may be right. I would say maybe the Kansas-Nebraska Act knocked the political equilibrium out for a while. Things calm down. Things calm down in Kansas when it's pretty clear it's going to become a free state. And then John Brown, who had caused trouble in Kansas in the first place, does this foolish thing, cockamamie thing.
or intentionally. I mean, he
Yeah.
you know, he said this will end in bloodshed, and that's basically I go to the gallows confident in the outcome. Yeah.
Tim, you've got some artifacts. Do you want to go through the artifacts while Sue does it, or you want to talk about them now?
Sure.
About Chandler and people like that?
Yeah. So the Civil War came to Macomb, just like it did in thousands of other communities around the country. Macomb itself, in some ways, was divided, just like the country was. I don't think it was. I think generally people in McDonough County were ardent supporters of the Union, supported Abraham Lincoln. There were some people who criticized Lincoln. People like one of the founders of Macomb, a guy named James Campbell, who do we have a picture of him? Yeah, Campbell was one of the founders of the town. I think at the time the name of the Macomb may have been Washington back in the 1830s.
Originally, yes.
Before it becomes Macomb. Campbell publishes a newspaper called the Macomb Eagle, which was a Democratic newspaper during the war. Criticizes Lincoln, certainly criticizes the coming of the draft, criticizes the imposition of martial law, and Campbell's publishing office was on the west side of our downtown square. You can see here an image of that side of Macomb at the time. Opposed on the other side, the east side, by the Macomb Journal, edited by a guy named James McGee, if I'm saying it the right way, a man who hosted Lincoln when he comes here in 1858. And they stay, where Sue's showing it now, when Lincoln comes to Macomb in 1858, in the middle of debating Stephen Douglas, he stays in the Randolph House, a hotel named for William Randolph there in the middle, an ardent Republican, a friend of Lincoln. When Lincoln steps off the train in Macomb, Randolph sends his carriage to pick him up, and Lincoln and McGee and Joseph Medill of the Chicago Tribune will stay in Macomb in a hotel. And it's there in that room there. You can see there an image of the room where Lincoln stays, and just one block north of us here in the museum, on the east side again, where they hatched the Freeport question. And what's interesting in a tragic way is after Lincoln becomes president, he appoints William Randolph to be provost marshal for the area. And one of the jobs of the provost marshal was to round up deserters, people who had either skedaddled from military service or refused to join the military if they were conscripted. Randolph goes out to Blandonsville to find a man who John Bond, who had not come to military service when he was called in. He finds him. There's a scuffle, and Bond and one of his brothers, who is coincidentally named James Bond, wind up murdering William Randolph. He doesn't die right away. He's taken to a hotel and lies there mortally wounded. Stays alive long enough to see his wife. He tells her, "I die for the cause," and he collapses in her arms. So yeah, there is a lot of drama here in Macomb, Larry, over both big issues of the Union, but also personal issues. And you know, the tension that is, again, I think part of this world, part of America, is not settled by the war. It continues probably into the post-war era in some of our politics. And, you know, in some ways kind of echoes today in ways that Americans can have different political ideologies, different views of government, different views of how political change should happen quickly or gradually, and so forth.
For those of you who don't live around here, this is before Western Illinois University was established in Macomb by 30 or 40 years.
Yeah.
So Macomb was a county seat. a country market town. It was affected by the railroad, which came in the 1850s, made transportation a little easier, brought businesses and different attitudes into town, including live theater and all kinds of things.
That's right.
So yeah, the war has a tremendous impact. In addition to what was going on in Macomb, anyway, you've got the draft, you've got different kinds of taxes coming in, you've got propaganda on both sides in the newspapers, and newspapers were not non-partial. Essentially, newspapers were party organs.
That's right.
And so, I mean, they on their masthead they would have Republican Party or the democracy, as the Democrats refer to themselves. And so you weren't going to get unvarnished news from the newspapers, except on very rare occasions when they agree that somebody died or something like that. So it was a partisan atmosphere. And in addition to that, it seems to me that in the 19th century, there were elections going on almost all the time. Local, regional, state, national. A lot of officers were 1 year term or 2 years term. So, I mean, it seems like there was constant agitation going on all the time about this.
Yeah.
And often these things became violent. People would take shots at each other or smack each other around or threaten each other. And so you had that going on. And I mean, it's really hard when you teach a class in the Civil War to get this local flavor in, because there are so many other things going on nationally that the students need to know as well. But it's really helpful to be able to teach from a museum or a place that's got artifacts and a history that Macomb has. Have you got anything you need, Sue? Now we can go on. One of the things I asked you to think about was in the comparing, if you can, two presidents, Abraham Lincoln and Jefferson Davis. Now, if I ask that question in Mississippi, I might get a different set of answers here. But if you were going to pick a president in 1860 for a war in 1861, let's say, and you wanted somebody with the best resume, wouldn't you pick Jefferson Davis?
Yeah, I think if you saw the resumes, the CVs, and didn't know the names, I mean, Davis had held national office for a long time. He had been Secretary of War, member of the Senate. He had a reputation for efficiency, for effectiveness. He had orchestrated reform in the military in the 1850s, equipping the U.S. military for what people thought at the time would be the great conflicts of the era, which would be in the West, the conquest of the West. I've done some recent work on Davis as Secretary of War, and he was very interested in international developments, military developments. He studied the Crimean War. He sent American officers to be educated in the great military schools of Europe. So he was a real visionary. And so, yeah, he brings all that experience to the executive office of the Confederacy, whereas Lincoln has not held public office. Think about that.
Just one term in Congress.
Yeah, I mean, almost, only slightly more political office experience than the current president, Donald Trump, right? So on the surface, it's Davis, you would think, has Lincoln hand over foot in terms of executive leadership capacity, especially in a crisis. You would predict Lincoln would go to pieces, like the two previous presidents, James Buchanan and Franklin Pierce, who had done literally nothing to solve the budding sectional crisis.
And remember, Davis was also a war hero at the Battle of Buena Vista in the Mexican War as his Mississippi Rifles, where he led a volunteer regiment. On the other side, though, Davis has a long, simmering, unattractive feud with Winfield Scott, the commanding general of the United States Army. So much so that Scott moves the Army headquarters to New York City, and Davis carries grudges, and he plays favorites, as he shows in the Civil War. I mean, some of the South's least competent military commanders are people with close ties to Jefferson Davis, like Pemberton and Vicksburg, or Braxton Bragg, or Leonidas Polk, and things like that. He doesn't, it seems to me, show a capacity for growth. Is that a fair statement?
I guess, it's hard to look at Davis neutrally. He is president of a country committed to, as the Vice President Alexander Stevenson says, committed to the cornerstone of slavery.
Yep.
So, we always have a slightly jaundiced view of Davis. If you compare the two presidencies, Lincoln, maybe after the fact, but I think it's probably true that Lincoln is more flexible. He is able to change the Union's war objectives from simply ending secession to abolishing slavery, and that's an enormous political success for Lincoln. Davis seemed to not be able to get away with wielding this kind of cudgel of executive power, which is necessary in wartime, so agilely as Lincoln does. He could not get various governors in the South to supply soldiers, to let supplies and men cross state lines. He's always got infighting with members of his cabinet. He did not have probably a sense of humor much at all, and certainly not in the way that Lincoln could always put somebody at ease with a story. And that's really important as a politician, to be able to connect with ordinary people and to be seen by the troops and not merely impress them, but also inspire them and encourage them. And Lincoln had that capacity.
And Lincoln, it seems to me, it takes breathtaking extensions of executive authority.
Yeah.
I mean, he suspends the writ of habeas corpus 3 or 4 times without congressional approval. The Emancipation Proclamation is a presidential proclamation. This is not an act of Congress, not require congressional participation or approval. I mean, that's breathtaking. You look for the previous presidents and you don't find somebody until you get to maybe Andrew Jackson, who uses the executive office in those kinds of ways, or maybe even Thomas Jefferson. And you don't find that with Jefferson Davis. He's much more traditional in the use of presidential powers, and yet he is in a revolutionary situation where maybe he should have done some more of that. But then again, maybe he doesn't have the kind of mentality. The other thing that impresses me about Lincoln is he doesn't hurry to make crucial decisions. I mean, he measures what he does. He seems to think it through. I mean, literally, the story about him sticking things in his hat are like memos to himself. Look at this a little bit later, You also get the impression that Davis worked himself nearly to frazzle. He didn't have much in the way of leisure time. Lincoln loved going to the theater. He loved conversing with friends, just sitting around talking, and not about serious things. He loved reading humorous magazines and the Petroleum Nasby and people like that. So there's a human side to Lincoln that you don't see with Jefferson Davis.
Yeah, I mean, we have to remember that Davis is always in crisis, and so maybe he doesn't have the leisure time that Lincoln does. But yeah, I think you're right. I think he lacked a kind of ability to relax and kick his feet up, maybe, which may have had consequences. If people perceive that a leader is tense and angry, it's going to rub off on them, and maybe they get uptight too.
His own wife says, when writing after his death, that he was normally sensitive to people's criticism, and it would be upsetting so he couldn't eat. He had blinding headaches, like a kind of a neuralgia in the side of his head. He didn't have very good health, and some of it dates back to his earlier years. I mean, he got some kind of eye infection when he was an Army officer. And Lincoln, while there's always these rumors about Lincoln having Marfan syndrome at the end of his life, the one thing everybody noticed about Lincoln was how physically strong he was. I mean, he really is strong. He's 6'4", 180 pounds. There was no fat at all on him, You have something, Sue?
We do have another question.
Okay.
Our good friend from Minnesota, Jeff, is with us,
Hi, Jeff.
and he's asking, post-Civil War, did Macomb trend Democratic or Republican, or did it vary?
The question is about Macomb. After the Civil War, did Macomb vote Republican or Democrat? Well, there you are.
Yeah. I think McDonough County, as I said, was on balance a Republican county. It was surrounded, though, downstate Illinois, by Democratic areas. Fulton County, right next door, was the first time it would vote Republican ever, was in 1896. And that's kind of more indicative of downstate Illinois politics. really throughout the rest of the 19th century is stalwart Democratic counties. A good number of Republicans here and elsewhere, I think, had the opportunity through their military service to make connections, especially if they were officers, and to move away from rural Illinois to big cities. They go to Indianapolis. Some from the regiment that I studied, the Illinois 103rd officers, go to the South and they buy plantations and run them during Reconstruction. They're the so-called carpetbaggers. They really were carpetbaggers. Yep. So, but I think generally, yeah, Macomb had this kind of liberal, relatively liberal slant, even though it's more or less a downstate area.
It's always struck me that there's sort of a Kentucky flavor to Macomb. And Kentucky had been Henry Clay State, largely Whig, and they had sort of slid into the Republican Party a little easier than Democrats did. As I recall, I think 96 was the kind of transition because a lot of Democrats saw the Democratic nominee for president that year, William Jennings Bryan, as radical. Mm-hmm. And then the McKinley administration played on that. And so McKinley got a lot of votes where Democrats had voted before. And I think since then, they've been mostly Republican, at least McDonough County has. But it's hard to tell. And again, you're dealing with arcane issues we don't have anymore, like free silver and things like that don't resonate anymore. So it's hard to tell what motivates people to do things. Thank you for the question, Jeff. Let's talk.
And on that note, in 1896, there was an Illinoisan who ran for president, a guy named John Palmer.
On the gold Democrat.
Who ran as a Democrat, who probably helped, again, to split the Democratic party in 1996.
And he'd been a Union Army general.
He's a Civil War veteran, Republican general, but becomes after the Civil War a Democrat, and opposes both the McKinley, the Republicans, and the tariff, but also the free silver and the kind of government intrusion in the economy that the Bryan and the main Democratic Party wants. And so, there's another Illinoisan that really shapes post-war politics at the national level.
Isn't it amazing how many presidents of the United States and candidates for president of the United States from about 1868 to the turn of the century were generals in the Civil War?
Yeah.
Ohio generals in the Civil War. Grant, Garfield, McKinley.
Well, they become railroad barons, and then many of them use that and their military experience to launch political careers, right? Yeah.
Do you find in your research about Illinois and Macomb, there much activity going on with something called the Grand Army of the Republic after the war? Were there sustainable chapters here of that? Those are Union Army veterans.
Yeah, there sure were. The Grand Army of the Republic is the veterans organization for Union veterans. And the founder of the local chapter was a guy named C.V. Chandler. You can see here on your screens on the right a picture of Mr. Chandler. Really wants to put Macomb on the map. He begins a lot of Macomb's first businesses, probably along with William Randolph. You can see the medal that Chandler won. He is a Civil War veteran. Very bright guy. He was in Williams College at the beginning of the war, drops out of school, though, to come back to enlist in the U.S. military, and he serves wounded at Chickamauga, shot through both legs. He tries to come home and convalesce and get better, goes back into service, but can't make it, and so he is discharged from the military and comes back and becomes a very successful businessman. Buys up all the buildings on the north side of the square, surreptitiously because he wants to have a park, knocks them all down, and then gives the land to the city. And
Chandler Park.
And that is Chandler Park. You can see it, the name of it inscribed there on the gate on the northwest corner of the park there, and provides money for our town's Civil War statue. It's also there on the west side of the park. You can see there an image there on the left. Our soldier, as I talk about when I give the walking tour of Civil War Macomb faces west. And I think that my view is it salutes the soldiers of the West from Macomb and from Illinois who were part of the great Union forces that moved into the Deep South and really are crucial in ending the war when they do.
William Standard, you mentioned from Canton, was in the 103rd Illinois.
That's right.
Where did he serve?
Enlists there. He serves mainly in the Army of the Tennessee, a Union Army, ultimately under William Sherman. The regiment provides support for the great campaign for Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1863. And then after the fall of Vicksburg, turn around and move northeast towards Tennessee. They see their first combat at the Battle of Missionary Ridge, Chattanooga, Tennessee. Very harrowing experience, I think, for soldiers like William Standard, who sees combat for the first time. Then 103rd Regiment is attached to the Army of the Tennessee, moving into Atlanta, Georgia, towards Atlanta in the Great Atlanta Campaign of '64. The book shows very, very colorful, sometimes graphic letters of the combat that they see in this kind of relentless day after day conflict as they move towards Atlanta and then encircle Atlanta and finally achieve the surrender of Atlanta. Moves on then after that to the March to the Sea, winds up the war in North Carolina. And he writes, really, I think quite interesting. For the first time at the very end of the war, he is enthusiastic. He believes the war was a good thing. He salutes Sherman. He says he marches in the Grand Review when all the armies go through Washington, and William Standard, this hardcore kind of reluctant abolitionist, I call him, says everybody's cheering for us, white and black alike. And I think there's a moment when he sees the glimpse of what America was becoming. And then he returns home back to Lewiston to be embraced by his wife, Jane, and they live together. She will outlive him by 10 years. He will pass away in 1881.
He remains a Democrat?
Yeah, long-term Democrat, right. Yeah. Buried in the Lewiston Cemetery. Yeah.
Interesting. Of course, during the March to the Sea, which lasted about 40 days, there was no mail coming from the Army. Did he ever write about his experiences? I mean, sit down and write a narrative of that month? Not, if it exists, we don't have a copy. The only thing we have is his letters, which end, I think, unfortunately, but perhaps logically, when he comes home. What the unique aspect of their correspondence is we have her letters to him. A lot of soldiers' letters that are published, you only get one side, but he seems to have sent, when he would receive a letter from his wife Jane, William would, and then he would write her back. He would send her back her own letter, so it would be preserved. It wouldn't get lost on the march or fall in the mud or something. So we have this wonderful kind of correspondence between a man and his wife during the war. It shows the impact of the war on a marriage. They have 3 kids, and they talk a lot about what it's like for her to raise the children as a single mother. So I recall she had the help of her father or another family member on the farm. Well, it's curious. She brought in boarders to bring in some rental income, and she talks sometimes about a court week. People would come into town for legal proceedings, and she would rent out rooms to them or serve meals. Interesting relationship with her father. Her father wound up being a Republican. They are hardcore Democrats. So you have these really interesting kind of family squabbles. It really shows you how the war literally divides families in places, these kind of border areas like central and downstate Illinois. Yeah. Did he talk about conditions in the Army? What he ate, for example? Did he complain about the food?
Oh, he's always complaining. Doesn't get paid. Doesn't get food.
Pays slow.
Doesn't have shoes. He was 40 years old when he enlists, Larry. So he was quite older than
That's very
a lot
old,
of
yeah.
enlistees. So he does have a lot of physical issues. At times he can't march, and he's given the he's allowed to ride in a wagon. He contracts a terrible fungus that nearly eats him alive in his feet and his legs. It's called St. Ambrose fire. And I can't. There's a real word for it, but I can't remember the name. So yeah, it's a typical grouchy soldier complaining about the quartermaster who's always failing, and he blames the government for it when he doesn't get paid. It's the Lincoln Army, it's the Lincoln men that are doing this to him. And of course, it's not intentional negligence, but it's just the failure of the logistical system for this kind of completely novel kind of extended warfare.
Especially if the armies are on the move.
Sure.
It's difficult to catch up to them. But if you read any soldier accounts, you'll always hear them talk about hardtack. This is hardtack. It's simply flour, water, and salt, and it's a hard cracker. They've had this for years, so maybe not quite as hard as this is, but this was the mainstay. They didn't have bakers traveling with the army, so this was the bread you used unless you got into camp and stayed for a while.
Yeah.
And they ate it. I guess you could eat it this way if you wanted to break every tooth in your head, but most of the time they cooked it with bacon grease over a fire to soften it, or they dunked it in coffee. Hold it up. Thank you, Charlene. You see that okay? There's nothing fancy about it, and they made these things by the million, and they often stored them in barrels and casks outside. So they got weevils in them and all kinds of things. Soldiers simply learned to close their eyes and eat what was ever in there because it was a source of meat.
I made some Irish soda bread for Thanksgiving, and it didn't really work. And the way that my kids told me that it didn't really work, because they've lived with historians. They say, "Dad, this is a little bit like hardtack." I'm sorry. So I don't think it was that bad. Yeah, there's stories of soldiers using hardtack to drive a nail into a board or fix a shoe. And so, yeah, there was this kind of soldier's humor, shall we say, and hardtack is really in the middle of that.
So you've taught Civil War class for years and years and years. What frustrates you the most about trying to get something across to students?
Yeah, that's a good question. I've thought about that. I think it's not just in the college classroom, Larry. I think that
Public at large
is historically, we historians, the people who write about it, have not made the Civil War a topic of interest, an inclusive topic for African Americans. It's a story. When you go to a battlefield, traditionally, when you talk about the Civil War, it is a story about, going back to D.W. Griffith, The Birth of a Nation. It's the story of white men fighting heroically against other white men, and neither side was really in the wrong. Both sides sacrificed, and at the end they shook hands and kind of made peace. And that narrative it's kind of partial. But it doesn't really offer the narrative of how the war affects, in a very different way, people of color. On the one hand, it ends, the great original American sin of slavery, but it doesn't provide the kind of opportunity and liftoff, shall we say, that you might have hoped for if you say that the war ends in 1865 with the defeat of the Confederacy, the rejection of secession, and the abolition of slavery. I'm sure you did too. When you teach the Civil War, you must go into the 1870s and Reconstruction.
Sure.
And the results of that are far more murky in what's really accomplished. The Constitution's changed with the Reconstruction amendments, but the application of those and real change on the ground, it's It's much more tenuous. You know,
And
and I try to get students to think, if you want to understand the civil rights movement in America and why we have Black Lives Matter now,
start with the Civil War.
my hook is let's see where that comes from, and maybe that's a way to engage a more diverse crowd and have a more diverse conversation about what the Civil War was really about.
180,000 African Americans served in the Union Army, almost always under white officers, and they suffered heavy casualties. I mean, they were crucial at a number of significant battles, even though they weren't originally intended to do that. That's what they ended up doing. That's why a movie like Glory, which is about the only one you can think of where it deals with the topic, is kind of important. And it's important for people to see that movie and understand it, and understand the racial tensions that were in that unit and with the raising of those kinds of units,
Right.
the way they were employed. Part of it, I think, is also this, and it's our fault. For the first 50 years or so after the Civil War history was written largely by Southerners. I mean, they preserved things. They got the parks named after them. They put the statues up, and they interpreted the war and Reconstruction in a particularly different way. I mean, I'm a big fan of Robert E. Lee. I mean, I think he was a splendid general and a good guy in lots of ways. And he was on a battlefield. He was a tactical wonder, but he lost. Okay, Grant's side won. All right, and yet, how many statues do you see of Grant, and how many picture mugs do you have with Grant's picture on it? And lots with Lee. So I mean, there's that, and I think there's some of that reevaluation going on now in the profession and in the way people teach classes. If you visit some Civil War sites now, they've included the African American story in it as well. I'm impressed by the number of soldiers who were in the Union Army during the Civil War who became involved in Reconstruction politics after the Civil War as office holders and as political leaders and so on. I'm thinking of Robert Smalls, for example, who was a slave in Charleston, stole a Confederate ship, sailed it to the Union fleet, got a commission, or spent most of the rest of the century representing the South Carolina district, 2nd district in Congress.
That's right.
And it's a really amazing kind of thing. You know?
Yeah. Jon Jones of Chicago, another man who active in the Underground Railroad before the Civil War, gets to Chicago, becomes active there in post-war Chicago government. He's the first man of color elected to office in Illinois in 1870. Very instrumental in persuading the Illinois legislature to abolish the Black Code, the infamous Black Codes of Illinois. So, yeah, you're right. I think they're there. These kind of figures are there. And
John Lynch.
I mean, the narrative needs to tell these stories not as separate history, but as part of this.
Yeah.
As part of this kind of integrated story about the war.
And again, there's hardly any more impressive person in the Civil War period than Frederick Douglass.
Sure. Yeah.
He's a tough, smart, shrewd, brave, loud, insistent spokesman for all kinds of good things, including arming of African Americans in the Army. You know, he meets with Lincoln. He kind of appreciates Lincoln, but Lincoln treats him like an ordinary human being in lots of ways. He tells John Brown, "Don't do this at Harper's Ferry. The slaves are not going to come forth. Okay, you're going to get killed." And he was right. You know?
Yeah, Douglass, I think, has a huge impression on Lincoln. Lincoln, unfortunately, does have this meeting early in the war with black leaders, and he says, "I want you to support my plan for colonization," which is this, in retrospect, what we think is a kind of cockamamie idea to get black people in America to leave the United States and to go to somewhere else, in West Africa or in the Caribbean. Douglass is adamant. Frederick Douglass says, no, we were born in this country. This is our country.
We're Americans.
Why in the world would we give up what we have here in this country to to go elsewhere? And that for me is very visionary. I mean, Douglass, for everything, the limitations that he a former slave, He knew that Lincoln had his own racist attitude, but Douglass had a bigger vision for what could be in this country, and he is really very important, as you said, Larry, for pushing the envelope to not just defeat the South, but to broaden what the war agenda was. I mean, he is out there recruiting black men to enlist. He probably has a role in Lincoln in the Emancipation Proclamation's paragraph that says, black men are encouraged to enlist in the U.S. military. And that's hugely important for legitimizing black citizenship. At least black men who get the right to vote in 1870.
Two of his sons served in the 54th Massachusetts.
Yeah.
The movie Glory.
Right.
One of them at least was a sergeant. Anything else frustrates you about trying to teach us? I mean, my impression is we passed too easily over the decisions some people had to make about which side they were going to be on. I'm thinking of serving Army officers in the United States Army, who sometimes made a hard choice about following their state into what was essentially potentially a treasonous activity.
Yeah.
You agree with that?
Yeah, I think that there's a couple of elements to that. One is simply that there's a lot of commercial interaction between North and South. And so if you're a Northern businessman, and certainly near the South, and you have a decision about what's going to happen if the war starts, there are some commercial interests besides these kind of political things that we talk about so much to be considered. But yeah, a lot of people had family members on both sides. A lot of people had friends in the military who, when they leave and go with the Confederacy, they have to weigh whether they're going to shatter that friendship if they stay with the U.S. military. Not just Robert E. Lee, but others too, especially in Virginia. A lot of Union officers who come from Virginia really have a very difficult choice to make over which side. And some of these decisions are very important in the war's outcome.
George Thomas, for
George
example,
Thomas.
Southside Virginia, goes with the Union, loses the family relationship with his sisters.
Yeah.
Was a key figure in the Union military effort. I guess.
I mean, Sherman was in Louisiana.
Yeah, right. Sherman was no friend of abolitionism.
No.
He was as bad a Negro phobe as you're going to find. I think one of the biographers of Sherman subtitles it "A Soldier's Quest for Order." And I think what may have motivated Sherman was the sense that Southerners had disrupted a functioning democracy, a functioning society. Mm-hmm. And so you have to punish that disorder. And once that's punished, you can go back to living normally.
Yeah. I guess I would say that, and I think maybe some of the conflicts we're having this month as we head towards the inauguration of the president. I think even despite that, I think it's still hard for us to imagine how much hatred and distrust there has to be for somebody to take up arms against the United States. This is what happens in the South. As much, I would say, as that hatred fuels this kind of war to the death, and for years and years and years, much longer than anybody thought, it's still in ways a war that it's a Victorian era war. And I hesitate, sometimes I get military students who want to talk about the Civil War as a total war.
Not.
And I just don't think it was. It's more kind of a 19th century war that sometimes goes off the rails. But, there wasn't genocide in the Civil War. Even Sherman's March to the Sea, which is probably some of the most heinous things that happened. There are incidents, for example, of Sherman ordering Confederate prisoners to walk before the U.S. Army to explode landmines that have been planted by saboteurs. I mean, that's a war crime, but it's very atypical. And there was not destruction of life, even among Sherman's hordes, that we associate typically with 20th century war, in which civilians are routinely targeted and suffered destruction.
I think somebody described the Civil War as a hard war.
Yeah.
It got harder as it went on, and you had incidents of massacres.
There were
prisoners.
massacres, right?
Most of them, interestingly enough, committed by Southern troops against African American Union soldiers. I'm thinking of Fort Pillow in 1864 and the aftermath of the mine over to Petersburg, the crater.
Yeah.
I mean, those are clear-cut incidences there. But warfare against civilian softer targets is really pretty rare. Now, had the war
And there's
continued 3 or 4 more
massacres just like there were outside the war too of Native Americans.
Sure.
There's the Sand Creek Massacre in
Sand Creek in
Colorado.
64,
There's
yeah.
what happens in Minnesota Territory,
Yeah.
where it's the largest mass execution in American history. 39, I think, Sioux Indians are hanged.
And Lincoln okayed those, but after he pared it down from more than 100,
Yeah.
it's still 39 for heaven's sakes.
Right.
And
Yeah.
and as near as I can tell, that revolt was caused by hunger and the fact that white settlers were encroaching on land.
Right. I mean, it was
set
typical.
aside for Sioux Indians in Minnesota, the Santee Sioux.
Yeah. And just a footnote, the general sent by the Lincoln administration to oversee the Minnesota Territory was an Illinoisan,
John Pope.
John Pope. That was his reward, I think, for losing the Second Battle of Bull Run, is he sent out to the Minnesota Territory to deal with this
Yep, that's true.
this crisis.
Lincoln had known his father, at least, in court in the 8th Judicial District in a variety, I'm told, and that the kind of consensus about John Pope was he was a braggart.
Yeah.
And he was, okay. Lee turns him every which way but loose, and he only lasts one battle,
Yeah.
thankfully.
Yeah.
Can
One thing I think is interesting for students to realize is that the war could have ended very quickly in right at the first Battle of Bull Run. I mean, Washington, D.C. was completely exposed. And, I think fortunately for American history, the Confederates that won that battle were not able to capitalize and march on the city and, possibly, capture Lincoln or capture the government.
even if they hadn't been able to hold on to the city.
Right.
The psychic loss
Sure.
would have killed us in foreign policy.
Yeah.
Would have helped shattered Union war morale, I think, which was at the beginning of the war maybe not as firmly strong as it was in the South. I mean,
Right.
It's harder. The South is looking for a quick victory. They're headstrong in lots of ways. They got these romantic viewpoints of war. One big battle and it's over with. Well, they almost carried it off at First Manassas.
Right.
Would you agree that no one battle won the Civil War?
No, I think that it is new in history that there is not, the Crimean War is really this kind of war of kind of attrition and grinding it out. And I think the Civil War is like that too. It's hard to get a decisive battle in the way, say, Agincourt happened in between England and France way back, or Waterloo.
Waterloo.
And
That's the classic one.
and Napoleon, of course. There's and what James McPherson has called in Battle Cry of Freedom is these turning points, and Antietam,
Henry and Donelson.
Atlanta, I think, was a political,
Vicksburg.
politically significant, because when Atlanta falls, it basically ensures the re-election of Abraham Lincoln.
Yeah, again, I think most people in the public don't realize Lincoln could have lost the presidential election of
Right.
1864. In fact, he thought he was going to as late as August. The war wasn't going very well. The economy was floundering. People were not volunteering for the army very
Right.
often. There seemed to be no end in sight. The casualties in Virginia were horrendous.
Mhm.
And then Sherman takes Atlanta, and Farragut takes Mobile Bay, takes the fortifications in Mobile Bay. The Democrats come apart. They nominate George B. McClellan, a failed general, on a platform which calls the war a failure, which he refused to accept. And as a consequence, Lincoln wins a very, very easy re-election. But it wasn't going to look that way 2 months earlier.
Yeah, I was looking at the numbers. Lincoln was not popular in much, even, it's a decisive electoral college, but he was not popular in much of the North. The so-called the areas where Copperheadism was really strong in Indiana, Ohio, Illinois. The McClellan is very popular. I looked in 1864, after 4 years of war, after the Emancipation Proclamation, Lincoln wins Illinois 54% to McClellan's 46% in his own state.
Yeah.
So you go to the Springfield, to the Lincoln Library, and it's this great, monument to Lincoln, the American hero. But there's a part of the museum that people who visit will remember it, where you go down this hallway and you're being bombarded with insults and shouts and vicious headlines that are anti-Lincoln after the Emancipation Proclamation and after he declares martial law, and he's a dictator, and he's a misogynist, and he's a fanatical abolitionist, he's a tyrant, of course he's assassinated, and all that kind of evaporates. He becomes the martyr, and we get the Lincoln Memorial. But when he was president, Lincoln was very unpopular. Not enough to lose the election, but he was, just a kind of typical American president who had his detractors, and was able to get a majority of the people to support him.
Question, Sue?
We have a question coming in. And so the question is, how did the slaves who left the South survive when they left the plantations during the war, especially the women and children?
How did slaves survive when they left the plantations during the Civil War and after the Civil War? Want to start with that?
Especially women and children.
Yeah, they're war refugees. And if you want to know what it's like to, be a freed person, especially during the war, you go look at pictures of refugee camps in places that are, unstable and in war zones today. I mean, there isn't really a policy about what should happen to the freed people during the war. And so they kind of attach themselves to U.S. military units and kind of follow them, not close enough to interfere with soldiers and to antagonize the soldiers, but close enough to where they'll be protected from their Confederate, sometimes their own former masters trying to catch them. Sometimes this ends tragically at like Ebenezer Creek outside of Savannah, Georgia, where a lot of freed people drown trying to cross this creek in kind of the swampy area of coastal Georgia, being pursued by a Confederate army. And
Go ahead.
Some of the men, as Larry said, do enlist and become. They're welcomed into the U.S. military. They serve in all colored units. Women and children are left to kind of fend for themselves. There are refugee camps. One camp is in Cairo, what's called Little Egypt, the southern part of Illinois, and Cairo is a pretty large refugee camp, freedmen's camp, where there are women and children and men put to work supporting the U.S. military. That also happens in the South. But it's this twilight zone, you could say, between slavery and freedom. That's the condition of Black people during the war. And even after the war, once the war is over, probably even as it's going on, one of the things that African Americans, especially former slaves, are trying to do is find family members. They're traveling around trying to recover people who've been sold.
A couple of things. One of the things you got to understand about slavery is the slaves were property, and they had no human rights. They couldn't testify in court. Obviously, they couldn't vote. Their marriages weren't legal in the eyes of the law. And so they're really cast adrift. Now, Grant in 1863 commissioned an Ohio chaplain named Major Eaton to kind of take over the war refugee issues in his department. And they established something, I think they called it a Negro paradise, a large farmstead where African Americans could go and grow crops for a small income and then get a share of the crops. There is another famous incident at Port Royal, South Carolina.
The Port Royal experiment.
Where a group of Northern capitalists and abolitionists, a place occupied by Union forces early in the war, took over an area which had been abandoned by the white owners.
Right.
And they put the slaves to work. They were interested in growing food crops, not particularly crops for sale. And it was an experiment that lasted only a few years, but it showed what could have been done. To me, if you're looking at Reconstruction after the war, the key failure, and you can understand why it was a key failure, there was no land reform.
Right.
You can give people the right to vote and you can give them freedom, but unless they have a way of earning a living on a stable basis, and in the South, that's ownership of land. You can't do it.
Yeah, I ask students, we debate what really happened in Reconstruction, and so we talk about the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery, the 14th Amendment,
Citizenship.
national citizenship, the 15th Amendment, suffrage, but there isn't. It's premature to think that the American government and the American people were in a position to envision a kind of New Deal, a Marshall Plan, kind of economic investment, huge investment to enable education and economic liftoff. And as I mentioned earlier, the conflicts we have in our society today, in the kind of the phenomenon of African Americans being chronically not having the kind of capital that white Americans have statistically, again, is a legacy of this kind of partial program for what was going to happen post-slavery, but the achievement of political rights, but this kind of economic and social opportunity remained elusive.
I think the best book on Reconstruction is subtitled "America's Unfinished Revolution."
That's right. Yeah,
and it's literally true. You have another question, Sue?
No.
No. Okay.
Yeah.
I thought you were motioning over there. Would you say this is a fair statement? Lincoln is great reviewing because he's surrounded by people who are mediocre. He's preceded by mediocre presidents. He succeeded by mediocre presidents. Is that a fair statement?
It's Lincoln's entire presidency is a wartime presidency, so we can't really evaluate his domestic policy compared to of course, his predecessors are routinely considered to be the worst presidents in American history. I guess I think it is fair to kind of salute Lincoln. Very pragmatic. He was willing to study Andrew Jackson's response to nullification back in the 1830s when South Carolina had threatened to violate and kind of defy federal law, and Jackson had said, I'll send the military into South Carolina if I have to.
I'll hang Calhoun higher than Hannon.
Yeah. And somebody asked Jackson, does he really mean that? And said, when Mr. Jackson talks about hanging, we look for a rope.
That's right. That's right.
So Lincoln apprehended the moment. I fault Lincoln for underestimating the strength of resistance in the South. He believed it would blow over and it would be kind of a tempest in a teapot. But I think once he realized, especially after Sumter, what he had on his hands, he is able to not surround himself with sycophants, surround himself with what Doris Goodwin calls a team of rivals. And strong people who have different views, who are committed to the Union, but who have bright guys who are willing to debate Lincoln and push him. And I think Lincoln, they benefit from the South's own disorganization. It's hard to compare Lincoln. You compare Lincoln to Franklin Roosevelt
or George Washington.
Or Washington.
Yeah.
These signature presidents, they're kind of lifted out of history. He's obviously he's not a typical 19th century American president. I mean, most presidents in the 19th century were very weak. Congress was, except for Jackson,
Yeah.
Congress was generally the strongest of the federal branches.
I think interesting about Lincoln is he's obviously very smart, and it's not due to his education. I mean, he's inquisitive, he's curious, he's analytical, he's cautious, he understands risks a little bit, but there's no way you can explain the massive eloquence he has in his written and his spoken word. I mean, there's no other presidential speeches anything like the Gettysburg Address, or the second inaugural, the first inaugural, or the private letters he writes to people about loss and death and so forth. There's a gift there that simply is you can't measure it.
Yeah, his father was probably illiterate.
Yep.
So where does this come from? It's this
natural genius.
He
I guess.
read from a young age.
Yep.
He
and absorbed.
Speech making was part of American education. You had to memorize things, and you had to, if you had chance education, you read. And we know that Lincoln was basically self-taught.
Yep.
But if you look at drafts of the Gettysburg Address, Seward wrote drafts, and they get shorter when Lincoln gets a hold of them. And the final Gettysburg Address just comes across. Very short speech, but it's not as puffy as what Seward, the more probably educated, kind of classically trained person, a guy who fully expected to be president in 1860, but was
And if you look at the featured
by
speech
Lincoln.
that day at Gettysburg, it was Edward Everett who spoke for 2 hours.
Right.
Nobody remembers what
No.
he said.
Yeah, he's
know?
the footnote. Right.
And Everett admitted that.
Yeah.
Lincoln spoke, I think, 292 words or something like that.
Yeah, if you weren't paying attention, you missed it. So, and his second inaugural is traditionally considered one of the great speeches in history.
Absolutely.
When he comes up with these just magical phrases, that set the tone for reconciliation, which has its own issues. But you cannot come away from Lincoln's second inaugural anticipating revenge on the South and a continued kind of demonization of Southerners, different from other presidents, shall we say. I mean, he is searching for common ground. Now, the cost of that is that as white people, North and South, find common ground, Black people
are
left out on the margins. we can't know what Lincoln would have done in Reconstruction because, of course, he's shot in 1865.
Could hardly have done worse than Andrew Johnson did. My favorite one line of Lincoln is from his first inaugural, where at the end he summarizes, saying, we're one nation, we must have peace, we must not be enemies. It's something about when the better angels of our nature assert themselves. I love that line, the better angels of our nature.
Right.
That's almost genius, just that putting it right in there. Didn't do any good, okay? Southerners ignored it, but it shows an agile, but contemplative mind. It's an amazing thing to watch. I can't imagine what it'd be like to hear him. You couldn't have heard him more than 30 or 40 feet away anyway, because there weren't any microphones. But to read what he wrote and then spoke those words is truly amazing. It's a one of a kind, one of a century kind.
Yeah.
If you could come up with a name of somebody who's really important during this period that most people don't know about, I'll start. How about the chief of ordnance of the Confederacy? Now I can't think of his name. Who essentially established the Confederate weapon system for procurement, production. So the Confederates don't lose.
Is that Stephen Mallory, or is he
that's Secretary of Navy?
Yeah.
But I mean,
Charlene, help us out here.
The Confederates didn't lose that war because they lacked weapons. Thank you, Charlene. Yeah, that's okay. It'll come to me. Maybe.
Yeah.
You got anybody?
Well, there's an Illinoisan who is it John Buford, the first? This very important. I mean, maybe if there's a battle in the war, it's Gettysburg. I mean, he's the guy who seizes.
He steps it off.
He seizes the high ground. This sacred space of the United American history, the high ground at Gettysburg on
Played in
that
the
first
movie-
day.
Played in the movie by Sam Elliott.
And, there's these, as clumsy as many officers are in the Civil War, which is partly responsible for so many deaths, there are these guys who know what they're doing, who make a difference. Because, once theory goes is once the Union forces establish the high ground at Gettysburg, the Confederates are forced to move uphill and try to assault them for 3 days, and it doesn't work. And with Gettysburg, the chance for, say, a European intervention in the war falls away. It's the last time that Confederacy will invade a northern state.
In any strength, yes. that's
Washington
right.
is protected. The South is not defeated, but it's demoralized. So there's these individuals who do make a difference.
And I'm thinking about Lincoln's cabinet. I mean, how many among us really think about what Salmon P. Chase did as Secretary of Treasury? Lincoln
Right.
didn't really much like Chase, and Chase didn't like him either. And Chase thought he should be president, but Lincoln kept him in place as long as he was useful.
Right.
And he was a really good Secretary of the Treasury. I mean, we went from a very limited amount of money to greenbacks, which were temporary, which expanded the economy to allow for more production and to keep essentially to keep the expenses within line. I mean, Salmon P. Chase and the Secretary of War, who was the Stanton, who would ream Lincoln out for sending him impertinent orders and so forth.
Yeah.
And Lincoln would say, well, did Mr. Stanton say that about me? And he said, well, yeah, he did. Well, he could be right. He knew how to work with people who didn't, on the surface, like him very much.
Yeah, I think
can't
somebody
find
with
that
a
with
thinner
Jefferson
skin
Davis.
would have gotten rid of them.
Yeah.
They would have found out in the newspapers they were fired.
Yeah.
I would say maybe a figure that we don't know about who had a very important international impact was a guy named Francis Lieber, who wrote something called the Lieber Code. It was a general order for military conduct during the war.
During the war, that's right.
And it really it's the basis for what become known now as laws of war.
Rules of war.
It becomes the basis of
Law
the Geneva
professor,
Accords.
Harvard, someplace like that.
A German immigrant who, he's in New York, and he not terribly long. It's really interesting actually to read it. You can find it on Google. And some of the things it authorizes today would be illegal, law of reprisal. But other ways, it tries to keep warfare within human, I guess the boundaries of what is considered to be fair treatment of prisoners. Certainly, it outlaws certain kinds of weapons. And so, if anything in the Civil War shapes future warfare, I would say, a lot of Europeans discount what happens in the American Civil War with frontal assaults, and you see what's happening in 1914 in Europe. You say, didn't you see what happened in the American Civil War? But the Lieber Code does, partly maybe because he's partly a European, does have an international impact, a long-reaching impact on what is today considered to be the modern laws of warfare.
Every major European power sent military observers to the United States Civil War. They accompanied the armies. They didn't learn anything.
Yeah.
They repeated the same mistakes in 1914 we were doing in the 1960s. It's an amazing thing. They must have just assumed the American Civil War was unique, only an American experience. It would never happen in Europe, in the real world. We got time for one more question? Okay, if you were to pick a couple of movies or videos that would help people really understand this era, what would you pick?
Well, we've talked about glory.
Yes.
Very important. Movies are always, for historians, are kind of bittersweet, you know, because you see them and you go, well, that's wrong and that's wrong. But movies capture the drama of history that is important to get people interested in history. Lincoln, which is based on the book Team of Rivals, the Spielberg movie about Lincoln. There's an old film that is a short film. It's based on a short story by a war veteran named Ambrose Bierce. It's called An Incident at Owl Creek. An Incident at Owl Creek. It's actually made by a French movie maker. silent film, about 18 minutes, but it's about a man who is going to be hanged as a spy, and the film. I won't reveal because everybody's going to watch it now. But it conveys, I think, the disillusionment of people, of soldiers who survived the Civil War, and that's a story that we don't know about so much. Is what happens to veterans after the war. Many of them addicted to opium.
PTSD. They have what amounts to
PTSD, what we call
PTSD.
PTSD now.
Yeah.
Besides the horrendous numbers of people who were casualties, who lost arms and legs and eyes and so forth, is the psychological impact of the war. So that's certainly worth it. Shenandoah, an old film starring Jimmy Stewart, black and white film, but one that conveys how the war fractured families. And it conveys a sense of the complications of the war. I would say just one more is the Conspirator.
I love that movie.
The film about the trial of Mary Surratt, whose boarding house was used by the team that
Killed Lincoln.
That killed Lincoln. Yeah, and so that's a very interesting and troubling movie about military tribunals and whether civilians should be tried or should not be tried by military officers, and that comes out right after the Second Gulf War.
Yes.
And so the context for that was, I think, particularly interesting.
I would pick Lincoln, and everybody was very impressed with Daniel Day-Lewis, and he was really good.
Yeah.
I was impressed by Tommy Lee Jones as Thaddeus Stevens. I was impressed by the man who played Secretary of State Seward, David Strathairn.
Right.
I was impressed by Sally Field as Mary Todd Lincoln. And the other movie I'd pick, hardly anybody's ever seen, and I'm not sure it was released to movies, may have gone direct to video. It's an Ang Lee movie. It's about Missouri guerrillas called Ride with the Devil. And it stars Tobey Maguire, who is Spider-Man.
That's right.
And a singer whose only movie I've ever seen named Jewel, and it takes place among Quantrill's Raiders. And I grew up in Missouri among descendants of Quantrill's Raiders. And it culminates with the raid on Lawrence, Kansas in August of 1863. And you get a viewpoint of what divided families and divided loyalties were like. And I thought, you just don't see things like that much anymore. Mm-hmm. I also like the movie about North Carolina during the war. What's her face? Wonderful here. But it has guerrilla warfare. It has home guards. It has cruelty. It has broken families. I can't think of the name of the movie. But it's a well done movie, and it's based on a really good novel. And again, most Civil War movies are based on works of fiction, as is based on Team of Rivals. I'm amazed at how good Daniel Day-Lewis was in that movie. I'm told he almost lived in the 19th century while the movie was being made. He continued writing with quill pens and things like that. That's inside acting.
You have one vote for Ride with the Devil.
Thank you. Somebody else has seen it. I've only saw it on television. I never saw it in the theater.
About Cold Mountain.
That's it. Cold Mountain is what I was trying to think of. I like Cold Mountain a lot. I like the music in it. I like the settings of it. I guess it was shot in Romania, although it takes place in North Carolina, I presume for expense purposes and so forth. Well, I think we're about out of time, Sue.
I think so.
Okay, let me talk about the next program. Is that okay?
Yes, absolutely.
We were going to take a hiatus until the 20th of January, and we're going to be back here at the same time. And the topic is going to be with my friend and colleague, Nick Pano, and it's called Russia, Putin, and the United States. Now, it's the evening of the inaugural, so I presume people will have their fill of inauguration stuff so they can tune in on that and hear it. And Tim, I want to thank you for coming. The time flies by in these things, as I warned you.
This must be halftime.
It's great to exchange information with you, and thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you both. And just another quick plug. We have another program on Sunday. We have a music program on our front porch with Sally Weisenberg and Don Bearbaum that we recorded on their front porch. And it's just some great music. So you can dance in your kitchen to it and join us on Sunday at 7 o'clock on our YouTube channel here. So thank you both, and we want to wish everybody a joyful holiday season. So thank you very much, and good night.
Be healthy
Merry
Be healthy,
Christmas.
please.
and Merry Christmas, right?